Please welcome Alzheimer's Association Chief Science Officer Maria Carrillo, University of Pennsylvania Professor Dr. Carl June, and the co-chair of today's summit, Times Alice Park.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Before we start, I want to get a quick poll of the room. How many people here have friends, family, loved ones who've been affected by Alzheimer's disease? Wow. And cancer. Okay, so quite a few. And we are fortunate, we have just heard very powerful stories from the patient perspective, and we're fortunate today to have with us two experts on Alzheimer's and cancer to really talk about the scientist view and what it takes to bring therapies for diseases like Alzheimer's and cancer to reality. Maria, I'd like to start with you. We saw in the opening video, Peter and Joanne. I got to know them very well, and you hear them talk about hope. We've had some disappointments in Alzheimer's with studies on promising Alzheimer's drugs in recent years, a string of them actually. What do you tell people like Peter and those in this room who just raised their hand? Yeah. Is there reason to hope?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and we get asked that all the time at the Alzheimer's Association, as you can imagine. Certainly losing two parents in the last 2 years, myself and our family, also drives that home. Like, what is there for our loved ones? And I think with the negative headlines, we certainly know that we have had some trials that we will have to learn from that have been reported. But this is a time where I feel the excitement of the scientific community really coming together. We are harnessing that knowledge that we've obtained. And we're going beyond, what you just heard, the plaques and the tangles, the hallmarks of Alzheimer's. We're going beyond that to understand that in a person whose average age is 73, there's a lot more going on. And I'm so proud of a partnership between the Alzheimer's Association and philanthropist Mikey Hogue called Part the Cloud, that in the past 5 years, for $30 million, has funded 39 early-stage clinical trials in almost every other arena, including inflammation, including stem cells and cell growth factors. So we're opening those doors to go beyond, and we haven't done that in the past. But it's time to get innovative and accelerate the pace.
Is the fact that we haven't had a national Alzheimer's program, which we now do, and it was created a few years ago, what difference has that made, and is that part of the reason, do you feel, that we weren't able to really delve into some of those possibilities in the way that you perhaps would have liked to?
Yeah, and that's a great question. We were actually the 7th country to create a national plan to address Alzheimer's, and the Alzheimer's Association wrote that plan over now almost 10 years ago. It was passed by President Obama about 9 years ago now, and I think it's so critical to create that plan so that all of us, all the federal agencies, all the philanthropists and private sector, all the hospitals and the physicians can sort of get on that same plan, because we weren't. We were on separate paths. And that's not good for a disease that's accelerating, and more baby boomers are turning 65 and in that age bracket of highest risk. So I think we are very hopeful. What it's also done is ensured that there's funding. And we've talked about HIV, AIDS, and what it did for cancer, and what cancer is doing now, and helping us all, and many living and being cured of cancer. And we need to focus like that. Those billions of dollars that we've neglected Alzheimer's and brain diseases for decades have got to change, and that is starting, and our Congress is recognizing it, our global leaders are recognizing it as well.
And Carl, you're a cancer researcher.
Yes.
I'd like to draw a parallel between perhaps where we were with blood cancers, maybe decade and a half ago, where using the immune system to battle a cancer sounded like a great idea, but really wasn't reality. Talk a little bit about, you are responsible for developing the CAR-T therapy, which has made a huge difference in the lives of many people with leukemia and lymphoma. It's a cell therapy, it's new, it's very innovative, hadn't been tested before. Bring us back to that time and talk a little bit about what it takes to make that scientific leap of faith and have people follow you.
So thanks, Alice. When the magnitude of the problem in the United States is about 600,000 people die of cancer every year. About 10% of those are blood cancers, and the rest are solid cancers like breast and ovarian. And with leukemia, it's a very rapid death, and unless you have a bone marrow transplant, it's almost always a death sentence. And the immune system had been thought to work against cancer for a very long time, but it had never worked enough to get FDA approval. And in 2010, we had the first immune therapy with CAR T cells in adults with leukemia. So they're now 9 years out and they look like they're cured. And we treated the first children in 2012 and they're now 7 years out. And so it looks like, you know, what was untreatable leukemia can now be cured with engineering immune cells. So it's a very promising area now in many different cancer centers around the world.
It's 20/20 hindsight though, right? I mean, at the time, you and I have talked a lot about this, about how people really often discouraged you because they thought, you know, was it really worth it? And did at certain times along that path, did you think to yourself, you know, is this what I want to dedicate my career to? What kept you going? Because I think that's what we're probably looking for in Alzheimer's, to say, do we need to take a leap of faith? Do we need to sort of really think out of the box, find something different, and test it?
So I'll say first of all that there's inflammation in Alzheimer's, so that the approaches we've learned in cancer may well apply to dementias, and I think that'll be a next wave of research. But you know, we had a very difficult time with getting our trials together. There was no industry. We relied entirely on philanthropy, Leukemia Society, and other generous donors.
And that was because it was just
it
hard
had
to
failed for so long that the National Cancer Institute didn't fund it. There was no industry. Like normally when you start with, say, a mouse experiment and then you have something that looks promising, there's a biotech or a company that you can work with. We didn't have any of that, and but then, you know, with 3 patients, it changed everything. That's what we learned. You can have a tipping point with a disruptive therapy, and we had 3 patients who had fatal leukemia, and all 3 had responses.
And we've talked also about how, you know, there's a lot of borrowing from different fields. So HIV has served as a model in many cases for cancer care, where we now have combinations of therapies the same way we do to treat an infectious disease like HIV. Maria, what lessons do you see as you're looking at the landscape now from what we can now do with cancer? What lessons do you see? What would you like to see happen in the field of Alzheimer's as far as new trials?
Well, what we've tried to do at the Alzheimer's Association, and in particular through this Part the Cloud program, which funded an inflammation challenge a few years ago, and funding biotech and innovative research that will make a difference, is try to really take higher risks. Because you're right, I think we have been, certainly in the Alzheimer field, have been more conservative than we should have been. And some of that is lack of funding, but some of it is that we've not been pushing. So we're pushing now, and we have to take examples like these wins that we've had in cancer, because you're right, all we need is to just crack that window open, and we can open the floodgates, and that's what we're looking to do right now. We have inflammation challenges that will help us, and sparking that through philanthropy is key, and that's, again, going to be a game changer, because not only do we have philanthropy right now, but we also have the focus of the federal government that can spur and take on those discoveries and amplify them so that biotech and pharma can continue to move forward.
Let's move a little bit from treatment to prevention now. And there's also been a lot of activity and interest in the blood biomarkers, the tests for Alzheimer's and cancer, with something as simple as, you know, reading something as simple as blood. Maria, how far are we, and how important is it, and how do you decide when you're just, you know, dividing resources, limited resources? How do you decide, you know, is it 50-50 to prevention, treatment? How do you make that decision?
Yeah. Well, you know, for us, I think what's important is to understand that we need both of those. We need both early detection and we need the therapeutics. And we hope that it's all moving forward synergistically, and we do our best to kind of shepherd that and nudge it that way. If we don't have early detection, we can't, as you heard in the earlier panel, kind of find those individuals that are on the pathway. Because ultimately, we don't want to be diagnosing people who already have a dementia. We don't even want to be diagnosing people who already have mild cognitive impairment. We want to be tracking this and making sure we address it as very mild, subtle symptoms start to happen, perhaps in our 50s. So if we don't have early detection, we don't pursue it, we're not going to get there, so that the therapies can be applied earlier and earlier, which is what cancer has done, taken elongating life by a few months to years, and even more remission and cure. That's the page we're going to take out of that book.
And Carl, when we look at cancers, the immune system, which you are very familiar with, is really sort of presented in the blood. How close are we to really being able to pinpoint usable, viable markers that will help us to detect cancer early enough where perhaps something like a CAR T therapy wouldn't be necessary?
Well, as you know, there are both familial cancers, which can be, and there are clinics now, the BRCA1, BRCA2. Laura Essman is going to talk about some of that later today for female cancers. And so that can identify a population at high risk. Then the other kind are so-called blood biopsies, which is, as you're relaying to, which is the ability from small samples of blood to detect evidence of either circulating tumor cells or the DNA or RNA, the nucleic acids that tumors make. And that, if it begins and there's early data that looks like it works, will then allow detection of cancer before and become part of a routine physical.
And you were earlier talking about for the people who were the first to try CAR T, it looks like a cure. Tell us what you mean by that and what that would mean for moving now the concept and the platform for CAR T to other cancers beyond blood cancers.
Yeah, so it's very exciting that the relapse rate is very low, and with very sensitive tests, we can't find any residual blood cancer in these patients. But we need more time to know exactly how safe it is and how many are actually cured. I wanted to point out one issue which is really central to the theme of this meeting, which is it's going to allow these principles not only to move into neuroscience, but blood diseases that are non-malignant. And one of the worst in the United States is sickle cell anemia. There's 100,000 African Americans who have this, and it's a fatal disease. 1 out of every 300 blacks that's born will get this. And we have the technology now, similar to what we do with CAR T cells, using genome editing to actually cure people with sickle cell anemia. Right now, they usually die by the time they're 30. But it's going to force, we need a major political regulatory change because these people, many do not have health insurance because of the epidemiology of that disease.
You raise a very good point about the cost. Yeah,
it's only maybe 3 years away.
Right. And that's an issue that you've seen too with the CAR T as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So access is clearly one of the themes of this meeting, as you say, Carl, and one of the things that we have to grapple with as we develop these innovative therapies and find ways to make them available to more people. Maria, I just want to go back to you and ask you then, when you look at where we are today with Alzheimer's, are you optimistic that we will get to the point where we can either, in Dr. Oz's case, be able to be smarter about finding cases like his mother's sooner, whether it's with a biomarker test, a blood test, or whether it's through improved education for helping people to really recognize and accept, the symptoms when they see them? Are you optimistic that we'll get to a point where we will be able to treat Alzheimer's the way theoretically we should, catching it early,
Right.
having good treatments for it once we do?
I really have never been more optimistic than ever when I stand in front of the Alzheimer's Association's International Conference, the largest on Alzheimer's, and I welcome over 6,000 researchers to our conference, all attacking this disease from different angles. I'm so hopeful, and that's what I tell my children who ask me what their chances of inheriting this might be. There is no doubt that early detection and even the blood test, which 10 years ago I would have told you was science fiction, but today is closer to a reality, is changing the way we do science, changing clinical trials, and it may very well change clinical practice soon. Today, we encourage everyone to think about ensuring that their loved ones have an appropriate clinical assessment. An annual wellness visit, a cognitive assessment is a part of your routine annual health care. That'll help all of us ensure that we have a baseline that we can continue to follow. And you know what? Not all memory changes are related to Alzheimer's, so that's good news. Let's find what is going on because it could be reversible. So there's lots going on, and awareness is critical. And of course, we have to continue to push that fight because it is not a matter of whether we will find a cure, it's when. And it's all about pushing now, not slowing down.
And Carl, I want to ask you about where you are as far as how optimistic you are when you look at whether we will be able to talk about cure when we look at some of the more common cancers, solid cancers, breast cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer.
Well, there's really tremendous progress on that, Alice. We're seeing now, we've had patients with prostate cancer and pancreatic cancer have responses now to these kinds of immunotherapies for cancer, and that before never happened. So I think that the only question now is a time scale of how long it takes. But within the next decade, I think we'll see many other cancers have curative therapies developed.
Great. Maria Carrillo, Carl June, I think that's a call to action for more work ahead.
Yeah.
For better cures, better treatments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.